Welcome back. In this video, we will look at Benjamin Graham's general recommendations around stock selection. You might wonder, who is Benjamin Graham? Benjamin Graham was a British-born American investor, and he is widely known as the father of value investing. Arguably, today he is more widely known as the guru of the billionaire investor Warren Buffett. In this video, we are going to look at the 5 key elements of stock selection recommended by him. These elements are used by many value investors, including billionaire investors like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. Now here are the 5 key elements as per Graham. The first key element is the company's general long-term prospects. As per Graham, an investor should examine the last 5 to 10 years financial statements and annual reports to understand the source of company's growth and the source of its profit. While analyzing growth and profit, the investor should be alert to possible sources of problems, like whether the company is a serial acquirer. Because if the company is involved in frequent acquisitions and write-downs or accounting charges associated with them, then there is a possibility of company indulging in creative accounting. Another source of problems for company is when they are chronically relying on other people's money. This kind of cash generation comes from cash from financing activities. This kind of activity may make a sick company appear to be growing, even if its underlying business is not generating enough cash. As an investor, another question that you should be asking is that, is the company relying only on a handful of customers to generate most of their revenue? Because if this is so, then its fortunes may turn overnight if the customer gets into trouble or shifts to a competitor. The investor should also look for positives around growth and profit while analyzing any prospect. Graham specifically talked about seeing if the company is generating steady growth in revenues and earnings. More specifically, Graham recommended that you should look for companies that have steady growth over a period of, say, last 10 years. It is also important for a good company to regularly and sufficiently invest in research or product development. It is good for a company to have a proven record of rejuvenating its business with new ideas or products. The next important element in stock selection is the quality and conduct of management. According to Graham, it is very important that a company's executive should clearly say what they will do, and then they should actually go ahead and do it. It is crucial to see what forecasts management made in the past and whether they were able to meet those forecasts or routinely fell short. More importantly, the managers should always admit their failures instead of just blaming the general economy or uncertainty or weak demand. It is also important that managers of the company should concentrate on managing the company rather than promoting their stock to the investing public. When managers are too focused on promoting their stock to the investing public, they are more likely to manipulate their financial statements to impress the investing crowd. Companies ideally should be focused towards long-term rather than wooing the investing crowd. It is important to keep an eye on accounting practices and the kind of transparency followed by the company. Graham said that the good companies are almost always very transparent and conservative with their accounting practices. The next important element in stock selection as per Benjamin Graham is the financial strength and the capital structure. Graham specifically recommended looking for companies that have sound capital structure and are generating more cash flow than they are consuming. He contended that a company with competent managers and stable cash flows would likely grow in value over time. In order to analyze a prospect, it is good to start by looking at the cash flow from operations and whether it has grown steadily over last 7 to 10 years. Warren Buffett in fact went a step further and recommended the concept of owner's earnings. Owner's earnings is defined as net income plus amortization and depreciation minus normal capex like maintenance. Now if owner's earning steadily grows at say 7 to 8% over last 7 to 10 years, then it is said that the company is a stable generator of cash and probably has bright prospects. Next, one should look at the company's capital structure, more specifically how much long-term debt is part of the total capital. Graham recommended that long-term debt of a company should be less than 50% of the total capital. Another way to put this is to say that the debt to equity ratio should be less than 1. Now, more analysis can be performed by looking at the liquidity ratios and other financial ratios to understand the liquidity position of the company. Graham also recommended looking at the past dividend policy and the current dividend policy. The truth is, during his time, much greater value was attached to a company paying regular dividends, but it is common today for companies to withhold dividends with itself if they see good opportunities to deploy the cash for growth. However, the onus of justifying this lies with the management. If the company is, say, a market leader and is continuing to grow steadily with scope for further expansion, then retaining cash instead of paying dividends may be justified. However, if the company is lagging behind its peers and its operations are faltering, and if the company still insists on retaining cash, it is likely that the managers won't be putting the cash to good use. Now that we have had a general discussion around the topic of stock selection, in the next video we are going to look at actual quantitative criterions for selection of common stocks. So see you in the next lecture. Now, in the last video, we saw the criterions laid down by Benjamin Graham for stock selection. We have reproduced two of these here. The first criterion is that the price of earnings ratio should be less than 15, and the second criterion is that the price to book value ratio should be less than 1.5. Graham recommended looking at stocks with price to earnings of less than 15 and price to book value of less than 1.5. More broadly, he recommended that in no case the price to earnings multiplied by the price to book value should exceed 22.5 for the stock. Now, this concept is used to derive a figure known as the Graham number. The Graham number is supposed to represent the upper bound of the price range that a defensive investor may pay for a stock. Some people suggest Graham number represents the intrinsic value of the company if it continues to grow at a steady rate. One may take it further and say that any company that is trading below this number may represent a potential opportunity if it is going to continue to grow at its current pace, or maybe at a better pace than the current pace. So suppose if you see a company trading considerably below this number, say at a price to earnings of 10, and say you also figure out that it is likely to continue to grow at least at its current rate, then the odds are, when many participants realize this, they would be ready to pay a higher price than they are currently willing to pay, which will result in the price of the stock going up. If the company ends up growing at a faster rate, then the market may as well be willing to pay a much higher price. Now, Graham's suggestion was to look at companies with sound business who are trading at a discount to their intrinsic value of the business. Now, this may lead you to believe that maybe the Graham number represents the intrinsic value of the business, but Graham and his disciples like Warren Buffett have always warned against attaching too much importance to any one number. So Graham number may be good to give you a sense of the value of business, but you should remember that intrinsic value actually represents a broad price range rather than a precise number. When a decent business is trading substantially below the intrinsic value, there is a good chance that when the market recognizes its worth, it will be willing to pay a substantially higher price for it than it currently is. Now, this is the premise on which value investing is based, but you might also wonder that if you can never be sure of the exact intrinsic value of the business, then how can you decide if you should invest in it or not? Now, I am sharing with you an example which John Dorsey of Morningstar fame shared in his book, The Little Book That Builds Wealth. John says that he had eyes on a company that had been growing at 30% over few years, but for a variety of reasons, things hit a wall and the sales slowed down to 10%. Meanwhile, the stock price dropped by about 50% from previous year's peak. As he describes it, he was sure that the company had plenty of room to grow and that the business in itself was competitive, but he wasn't sure going forward if the company would grow at 15% and may be able to regain its growth rate of 30%. In his own words, this is how he explains why he still decided to buy the stock. Quote, "While I did not know exactly what corporate executive boards' share were worth, I did know that the stock price at the time implied that the market was assuming a 10% growth rate. So my task was to simply decide how likely it was that the company would never grow faster than 10%. But on my research, I thought that that was a very unlikely outcome, and so I bought the stock. If the company returned to a 15% growth rate, my investment would do pretty well, and if the company returned to a 20% growth rate, I would have a home run. Only if the company deaccelerated to a single-digit growth rate would I lose money, and I thought the odds of that happening were acceptably low." Unquote. This idea has been repeated in different forms by both Benjamin Graham and Warren Buffett over the years. So basically, you need not know what exactly the stock is worth or what exactly the future might bring. But if you can get a fair sense that the future would likely be better than what the current prices are implying, and you make sure that you don't overpay for it, then that is probably all you need to know to successfully invest for the long run. I'm also going to share with you guys Warren Buffett's critique for finding the exact intrinsic value. In his critique for finding the exact intrinsic value, Warren Buffett had the same thought process in his mind when he said, quote, "It is better to be approximately right than precisely wrong." I'll conclude this lecture with Benjamin Graham's word on the topic. Quote, "The essential point is that security analysis does not seek to determine exactly what the intrinsic value of a given security is. It needs only to establish that the value is adequate to justify a stock purchase, or else that the value is considerably higher or considerably lower than the market price. For such purpose, an indefinite and approximate measure of the intrinsic value may be sufficient." Now that we have seen the basics of financial statements, we'll now look at how we can actually analyze balance sheets. There are essentially two tools to make this analysis. These tools are known as the common size analysis and the balance sheet ratios. In this video, we are going to look at what is known as a common size analysis of the balance sheet. In a later video, we'll look at the ratio analysis. Now, analysis of a company's balance sheet provides insights into the company's liquidity and solvency. Let's first understand these terms, liquidity and solvency. Liquidity refers to a company's ability to meet its short-term financial commitments. Assessment of liquidity requires evaluating a company's ability to convert assets to cash and to pay for operating needs. On the other hand, solvency refers to a company's ability to meet its financial obligations over the long term. Assessment of solvency requires evaluating a company's financial structure and its ability to pay long-term financial obligations. Now let's understand the tools for analyzing the balance sheet one by one by starting with the common size analysis. A vertical common size analysis involves stating each balance sheet item as a percentage of total assets. Common size statements are useful in comparing the company's balance sheet composition over time and across companies in the same industry. Let's look at an example. Now this table has balance sheets of three hypothetical companies. Company C with assets of 9.75 million is much larger than Company A and Company B, both of which have 3.25 million in assets. Let's look at a common size balance sheet for these three companies, which we use to compare these companies. Now this is the common size balance sheet for these three companies. What you can see here is that most of the assets of Company A and Company B are current assets. However, Company A has nearly 60% of its total assets in cash and marketable securities, while company B has only 6%. Hence, company A is more liquid than company B, since it can quickly meet any cash obligation that may arise in its usual course of business. Next, we see that the company A has not much of a current liability, as its current liabilities are less than 10,000, while it has a cash of 1 million, which is more than sufficient to meet any near-term financial obligation it might have. In contrast, company B has 2.5 million in current liabilities, which actually exceeds the available cash of only 200,000. To pay these near-term obligations, company B will need to collect some of its account receivable, sell more of its inventory, or maybe, if this does not materialize, it may need to borrow from a bank or raise long-term capital. Company C also looks more liquid than company B, as it holds over 30% of its total assets in cash and short-term marketable securities. At the same time, company C's current liabilities are only 6.2% of the total assets. Also, we note that the company C's 3.3 million in cash and short-term securities is substantially more than its current liabilities of 600,000. But if we were to look at the solvency, we see that 98.5% of company C's assets are financed with liabilities. If company C experiences significant fluctuation in cash flows, it may not be able to pay interest and principal on long-term liabilities. Hence, company A is a lot more solvent than company C because it has less than 1% of assets financed with liabilities. The common size balance sheet analysis may also reveal difference in a company's strategy. So in this case, by comparing the asset composition, we see that the company C has made a greater proportion investment in property, plant and equipment, probably because it manufactures more of its products in-house. On the other hand, presence of goodwill in case of company B balance sheet signifies that it has made one or more acquisitions in the past, as any excess price paid over the assets of a target company are recorded as goodwill on the balance sheet. In general, the common size analysis is useful for cross-sectional analysis, that is comparing companies with each other for a particular time period or comparing a company with an industry or sector data. In this video, we have broadly covered common size analysis of balance sheet. In the next video, we are going to look at the common size analysis of income statement. Now let's look at some other assets which are not current assets and hence are known as non-current assets. These are also known as long-term or long-lived assets. Let's look at some common non-current assets. Starting with property, plant and equipment. These are tangible assets used in company operations and are expected to provide economic benefits over more than one fiscal period. Example of tangible assets include land, buildings, equipments, machinery, furniture, and even natural resources like minerals and petroleum resources. Property, plant and equipment are reported at their historical cost, which is adjusted for depreciation or impairment due to age or wear and tear. Hence, depreciation is accumulated over the life of an asset and subtracted from historical cost to arrive at the value of this asset. Another non-current asset is investment property. This asset is the property which is not used for production of goods or services or for administrative purposes. Instead, it is used to earn rental income or capital appreciation or both. The next common non-current asset is intangibles. These are essentially identifiable non-monetary assets without any physical substance. Examples of intangibles include patents, licenses, and trademarks. Goodwill is another intangible, which is a result of a company paying a premium above the fair value of the assets being acquired as part of a merger or acquisition. This excess amount over the fair value is recorded as goodwill on balance sheet and is another intangibles. There may be a range of other non-current assets on the balance sheet as separate items, and they can be understood by going through the notes to account section associated with them. Now let's look at different types of non-current liabilities. Simply put, all liabilities not classified as current liabilities are considered to be non-current or long-term liabilities. Let's look at two common types of non-current liabilities. First of these is long-term financial liabilities, which includes loans and notes payable or bonds payable. Liabilities such as loan payables and bond payables are reported at amortized cost on the balance sheet. For example, if a company issues $10 million of bonds, then the bonds are reported at a long-term liability value of $10 million. The next common non-current liability is the deferred tax liability. Deferred tax liability is a result of difference between a company's income as reported for the tax purposes and the income as reported for financial statement purposes. So for example, if a revenue is not recorded for tax purposes but is reported in income as part of financial statement of the company, then the taxes associated with the income have not been paid and hence are a liability that would need to be settled in the future. This liability is recorded as deferred tax liability. As you can see here, there are other non-current liabilities for this company, but their nature would be similar to what we described here, and essentially they represent long-term obligations of the company that would need to be settled in the future. With this, we come to the end of the discussion on non-current assets and liabilities. In the next video, we'll look at another component of the balance sheet, which is known as the owner's equity. Now, starting with this video, we will cover the very important concept of trend lines and trend channels. It is a common understanding among academics that the market goes up and down randomly, but the truth is that markets show a definite pattern in their movement. In fact, prices may move in trends for extended period of time. This trend may either be up, or the trend may be down, or the trend may be sideways. An uptrend is one where the prices move up overall, like shown here. A downtrend is one where the prices move down overall, like the one shown here. A sideways trend is one where prices tend to be in a broad horizontal range for a period of time. Any trend may last either for a brief period of time, or the trend may last for a longer duration as well. Whatever be the case, sooner or later trends change. So for example, a trend may change from an uptrend to a downtrend, or from a downtrend to an uptrend. They may also change direction without reversing. So for example, an uptrend may be followed by a sideways trend, and after this sideways trend is complete, an uptrend may resume. Traders or investors essentially make money by capitalizing on uptrends or downtrends. This is done either by following a trend until it is reversed, or by anticipating a reversal of trend. As someone looking to profit from financial markets, your real challenge is to try and recognize a trend at the earliest possible stage of development so that you can enter a trade to profit from it. Your next task is to figure out whether the trend has ended so that you may book profits and exit the trade. Trend lines are a basic tool that helps us in identifying and following a trend. So without further ado, let's go ahead and understand trend lines. A trend line is a line that helps in identifying a trend because all the price action and retracements in the trend are supported by this trend line. So you will find that often all the smaller counter-trend fluctuations in a trend are supported by a trend line. You may also see that when prices are plotted for many years, many times longer term uptrends are also supported by a single trend line. Trend lines often help in identifying if a trend is likely to continue or not. That is, trend lines may also help in identifying if the current trend has reversed. Specifically, when prices come and touch a pre-existing trend line and reverse, it indicates that the trend is going to continue. In contrast, if prices come to touch a pre-existing trend line but don't find any support and instead fall through it, then it's an early sign that the trend may be about to reverse, or at least a substantial counter-trend move might be in action. Apart from this, trend lines can be combined with other price patterns and concepts like support and resistance in order to make trades. In an uptrend, trend lines are formed by joining the lows of minor fluctuations that are against the trend. So the bottoms formed by minor counter-trend moves in an uptrend are connected to form an uptrend line. The tops formed in an uptrend may or may not lie on a straight line. This implies that if you were to connect the various intermediate tops in an uptrend, they may not lie on a straight line and may instead have some kind of a crooked formation. In some special cases though, this may not be true, and these intermediate tops may also fall on a straight line. We will be discussing this aspect of uptrends when we cover trend channels. Now let's look at how we can create a trend line in a downtrend, that is when the prices are falling. A trend line may be created by joining the intermediate tops of the minor upward corrections in a scenario of falling prices. These intermediate tops often lie on a line which would be a downward sloping trend line. In this case though, the various bottoms formed in the fall may or may not fall on a straight line. Now let's formally look at how we can draw trend lines. As you would already know, a line can be drawn by joining any 2 points. So in order to draw a trend line, we need to determine 2 points. In case of an uptrend, these 2 points are supposed to be 2 minor counter-trend reversal bottom points, while in case of downward trending lines, these 2 points are supposed to be 2 minor top reversal points to establish a downward sloping trend line. So we have essentially connected 2 important established bottoms in order to create an uptrend line. Similarly, we have connected 2 established tops in order to create a downtrend line. As you can see in this chart, once we have established a trend line, further price movements seem to have been supported by this trend line again and again. Also, a trend reversal seems to occur only once this established trend line is broken so that the prices trade below the trend line. Similar is the case in a downtrend line. Once we have established a trend line using 2 established tops, we see how prices cannot sustain above this trend line as long as the prices are in a downtrend. Once the downtrend is over, the prices start trading above this downward sloping trend line. Once a trend line is established, it serves us 2 purposes. Let's understand this by looking at the uptrend line here. The first purpose of a trend line is that once a trend line is broken, that is when prices go through it, it decisively signals that the advance has run out and it calls on you to get out of your position and look to reinvest the proceeds elsewhere. Another purpose served by the trend line is that it tells you how long you should stay on in a trade. So for example, in this case, if you see that some kind of reversal formation takes place far away from the trend line, you should not exit the position just because of the formation of this reversal pattern. This is true unless you see that in subsequent move, the prices fall below the trend line. So if the prices continue to stay above the trend line, then it is best for you to ignore this reversal formation. And this will enable you to stay on to the trend for incremental profits. Experienced traders find this important because they realize that they should hold on to their positions for as long as possible to maximize the returns on profitable trades. Experienced traders realize that it is expensive to keep switching out from one position to another on appearance of every reversal pattern. As with experience, they have learned that the trends just don't reverse on appearance of a reversal pattern. So by getting out of a position on appearance of a reversal pattern, you may stand to lose by exiting trades prematurely. So it becomes important not only to identify trends using a trend line, but also to hold on to winning positions unless these trend lines are broken decisively. In order to determine whether the trend line has been broken, we will be looking at some other concepts in the next video. So see you in the next video. Now we saw that in common size analysis of income statement, each income and expense line item is expressed as a percentage of net revenue, which is essentially the net sales of the company. In case of common size analysis of balance sheet, each asset, liability and equity line item is expressed as a percentage of total assets. Now in case of common size cash flow statement, there are two alternative approaches. The first approach is to express each line item of cash inflow as percentage of total cash inflow, and similarly expressing each line item of cash outflow as percentage of total cash outflow. This approach helps us clearly see what dominates the cash inflow or outflow. Another method to perform common size cash flow statement analysis is to express each line item as percentage of net revenue. Now in this example for this company, we see that in case of the inflows, the common size statement is telling us that around 97% of the inflows came through receipts from customers and only close to 3% of the receipts came through sale of equipment. Similarly, in case of outflows, we are expressing all the outflows as percentage of total outflows, and we see that here payments to suppliers dominate the outflows, so that around 49% of outflows are because of payments to the suppliers. The next highest contribution to outflows comes from the payment to employees as employee expense probably, and the next highest source of outflow is the payments for other operating expenses. So by looking at the common size analysis, it is easy to determine what dominates the cash inflow or the cash outflow. Now in the next example here, we see that the common size analysis is expressed as a percentage of net revenue. Under this approach, each line item in the cash flow statement is shown as a percentage of net revenue. This common size exhibit is developed using the net revenue of 23,598 for the company. Each line item is expressed as a percentage of net revenue. The common size format makes it easy to see the trends in cash flows rather than just looking at the total amount, and it is very easy to use this common size statement to forecast future cash flows. This is so because each line item is represented as a percentage of net revenue. Now if an analyst forecasts net revenue for the future period, he can use the same ratios to determine forecast for each line item. Now let's take another example of common size cash flow analysis using the net revenue. Now we have shown here a hypothetical company and its cash flow expressed as a percentage of net revenue for a period of 3 years. Let's see what conclusions can be drawn by looking at this. So for example, here we see that the depreciation and amortization expense is less than 2% of the total net revenue in the year 2010. However, as a percentage of total revenue, it has been increasing each year, and in the year ending 29 January 2010, adding this expense back to determine operating cash flow has a significant impact on the cash flow from operations as a percentage of total revenue, because its size was approximately 60% of the net profit margin. Also we see that this company's capital expenditure is relatively small. It is less than 1% of revenues in most recent years, and the cash flow from operations as a percentage of total revenue indicates that operating cash flows are more than sufficient to cover these expenditures. Also we see that the company's operating cash flow as a percentage of revenue is usually much higher than the net profit margin, with the exception of the year 2009. In that year, it seems the net profit margin was 4% and operating cash flow as a percentage of total revenue was 3.1%. The primary difference between the year and the other years appears to have been a significant reduction in accounts payable. In each of the other years, accounts payable increased. For the year ending 29 January 2010, the operating cash flow as a percentage of total revenue was 7.38% and the net profit margin was 2.71%. Also, let's see how this company uses its positive operating cash flow. In the year ending 29 January 2010, the largest cash outflow was for acquisition of business, which is essentially an investing activity. In prior years, much of this company's operating cash flow was used to repurchase its own stock, which actually comes under the financing activity. In each of these 3 years, the company's purchases of investments were less than the amount of maturities and sale. Thus, on a net basis, the investments of the company proved to be a net source of cash. With this, we have come to the end of common size analysis. In the next few videos, we'll look at ratio analysis for different components of financial statements. Welcome back. In this video, we are going to briefly look at the different valuation ratios that have been used often in investment decision making. An example of a valuation ratio is the price to earnings ratio, also known as the PE ratio. It is one of the most widely cited indicator in discussing the value of stocks and relates price to earnings per share. Also, some analysts use some other market multiples like price to book value and price to cash flow in order to make some sense of the valuation of a stock. Here we have shown some common valuation ratios. The first important ratio is the price to earnings ratio, which is calculated by dividing price per share by the earnings per share. This ratio tells us how much an investor is required to pay for per dollar of earnings. So if the price to earning ratio is 10, then it would mean that for every $1 of earnings, the investor is paying $10. Because PE ratios are calculated using net income, this ratio can be sensitive to non-recurring earnings or one-time earning events. Also, net income is considered to be more susceptible to manipulation than cash flows, so it may be wise to see price to cash flow as an alternative measure, especially when earnings quality may be an issue. Also, instead of using the net income as earnings in the PE ratio, one can also use EBITDA, which is the earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization. EBITDA per share is calculated using earnings before interest, taxes and depreciation. It can be used to eliminate the effects of different levels of fixed asset investment across companies. This facilitates comparison between companies in the same sector but at different stages of infrastructure maturity. Then another common ratio that is used is price to sales ratio. The price to sales ratio is calculated by dividing price per share with sales per share. Now this ratio is used as a comparative price metric, especially when a company does not have positive net income, so you cannot use its earnings to calculate the PE ratio. So when you have to compare a company which has no earnings with a company which has positive earnings, you won't be able to use the price to earnings ratio. In some cases, you may still try to make sense of the valuations by looking at the price to sales ratio. Another common ratio is the price to book value. Now, price to book value ratio facilitates useful comparison of a company's stock price. This ratio is often interpreted as an indicator of market judgment about relationship between a company's required rate of return and its actual rate of return. Assuming book values reflect the fair value of assets, a price to book value of one is interpreted as an indicator that the company's future returns are expected to be exactly equal to returns required by the markets. A ratio greater than 1 indicates that future profitability of the company is expected to exceed the required rate of return, and a value of less than 1 would indicate that the company's future profitability are not expected to exceed the required rate of return. Now, using book value as a measure in the price to book value can be misleading, especially when you are valuing technology companies. Now, typically technology companies do not have a lot of fixed assets, which means that there is a very high chance that their book values are not truly reflective of their true worth, because their true worth lies in the human resources of their company. In such scenarios, the price to book value ratio becomes irrelevant for your analysis. Similarly, while using any of these ratios, it is very important that you use your common sense in determining whether a specific ratio is applicable in case of the company you are analyzing. With this, we have come to the end of this section on financial ratios. Next, let's look at another component of the balance sheet, which is equity. Now, equity is the owner's residual claim on a company's assets after subtracting its liabilities. Equity represents the claim of owner against the company. It includes funds directly invested in the company by the owners, as well as earnings that have been reinvested over time. Now let's look at the various possible components of equity. Now note that not all components that we are going to discuss may be found on all balance sheets. As we discuss these components, you will see that some of them are not shown in case of V group balance sheet, but for a complete understanding, we'll briefly cover each of the components. The first component of equity is capital contributed by owners, also known as common stock or issued capital. This is the amount contributed to the company by the owners. Ownership of a corporation is represented through issuance of common shares. For each company, the number of shares authorized, issued, and outstanding must be disclosed to the shareholders. The number of shares authorized represent the number of shares that may be sold by the company under its article of incorporation. The number of issued shares refers to those shares that have been sold to the investors, and the number of outstanding shares consists of issued shares less treasury shares. We'll see what are treasury shares in a bit. The second component of equity is preferred shares. Preferred shares have rights that take precedence over the rights of common shareholders. These rights refer to receipts of dividend and also receipts of assets if the company is liquidated. The next component of equity is treasury shares. These are the shares of the company which have been repurchased by the company and are held as treasury shares rather than being cancelled or extinguished. The company can in future sell or reissue these shares. Companies repurchase their shares if they perceive them to be undervalued or if they need to use them to pay as stock options to the employees. So it is up to the company to either cancel or extinguish these shares or hold them as part of equity on their balance sheet in the form of treasury shares. The next important component of equity is retained earnings. This is the cumulative amount of earnings recognized in a company's income statements. It represents the share of profits of shareholders that have not been repaid to them as dividends. The last component of equity is known as the minority interest or non-controlling interest. This represents the equity interest of minority shareholders of the subsidiary companies that have been consolidated by the parent company, but these subsidiary companies are not wholly owned by the parent company. So while all assets of the subsidiaries are included in the consolidated balance sheet, in order to represent the fact that the parent company does not wholly own the subsidiary, in the equity section of the balance sheet, a section known as minority interest is created to represent the share of minority interest shareholders. Now with this, we have broadly seen the various components of a balance sheet. In the next video, we are going to briefly look at the income statement. Now starting from this lecture, we are going to look at financial ratios. A financial ratio expresses one financial quantity with respect to another and conveys some aspect of a company's performance or valuation. For example, one common ratio is net profit margin, which is calculated by using the net income and dividing the net income by revenue. This ratio essentially tells you the percentage of revenue in excess of all its costs, which results in a profit for the company. For example, this ratio can be used to answer the question that which company is more profitable when comparing two or more companies. Let's look at an example. Say company A has 100,000 as net income, while company B has 200,000 as net income. So you see that the company B generates twice as much net income as company A. But if company A revenue is 2 million, while the company B revenue is 6 million, you see that the profit margin of company A is given by 100,000 divided by 2 million, which is 5%, while the profit margin for company B is given by 200,000 divided by 6 million, which is close to 3.33%. So company A generates $5 profit for every $100 in revenue, while company B generates $3.33 profit for every $100 revenue. Hence, actually, the company A is more profitable despite the fact that the company B is reporting higher revenue and net profit. However, this analysis does not tell us why company A is more profitable than company B, and we would need to dig deeper to answer that question. Now, ratio analysis enables investors to evaluate past performance, assess the current financial position of the company, and gain insights useful for projecting the future results. The ratios serve as an indicator of some aspect of a company's performance. We have listed these various aspects here. The first aspect is the company's financial flexibility or ability to obtain cash required to grow and meet its obligation. The next aspect may be the management's ability to manage a company efficiently. Also, the ratios will help you track the changes in the company or industry over time. Also, ratio analysis enhances the comparability of a company with its peer companies or with the relevant industry. Theoretically, it is possible to calculate a number of ratios, but for our purposes, we are going to categorize ratios based on what aspect of performance a ratio is intended to measure. Common ratio categories includes activity ratios, liquidity ratios, solvency ratios, profitability ratios, and valuation ratios. Let's briefly see the definitions of these different categories, and then we will have a look at few of the ratios in each of the categories. The first category of financial ratio is the activity ratio. Activity ratios measure how effectively a company performs its day-to-day tasks, such as the collection of receivables and the management of inventory. The next category of financial ratio is the liquidity ratio, which measures the company's ability to meet its short-term obligations. Then you have the solvency ratios, which measures a company's ability to meet its long-term obligations. The next category of ratios is the profitability ratios, which measures the company's ability to generate profits from its resources. Then you have the valuation ratios, which measures the quantity of an asset or cash flow associated with the ownership of a company's share. One should understand that these ratios are not mutually exclusive. For example, if there is an activity ratio that measures how quickly the company collects its receivables due from its customers, it is also useful in assessing the company's liquidity because the collection of revenues increases the cash available to the company. Now, in the next few videos, we'll look at a variety of ratios associated with each of these categories. Now, in this lecture, we are going to look at financial notes and supplementary schedules that always accompany every financial statement by a company. The notes, which are sometimes also referred to as footnotes, always accompany the financial statements of the company. These notes help you in better understanding the income statement, balance sheet, and the cash flow statements. For example, the notes to account to V Group balance sheet may clearly mention that the fiscal year for the company corresponds to the calendar year, that the statement has been prepared on a consolidated basis, that is, it includes performance of the subsidiaries of the company also. Financial notes are also used to disclose what accounting policies have been followed with respect to depreciation and inventories and other such issues. It may also disclose what is the company's revenue recognition policy, as in when the company recognizes the revenue. A company may decide to recognize the revenue when it ships its goods, or it may decide to recognize the revenue when the shipment is actually delivered and accepted by the customer. All these details are found in the notes accompanying the financial statement. You should understand that all this information is very important in determining the validity of the numbers provided by the company and how these numbers may be impacted by the change in policy. Also, by looking at the notes associated with the account statements, you will get a complete picture as to whether the company is aggressive or conservative with respect to recognizing revenues and expenses. While this may seem insignificant to someone new to investing, the truth is that notes to account is the single most important source for information in determining the quality of numbers provided in the financial statements. Also, often companies use the notes to account section to provide information on other factors that may affect the operational or financial performance of the company, especially if these factors are not captured as part of balance sheet, income statement, or the cash flow statement. For example, information related to any contingent claims arising out of legal issues or derivatives, or any guarantees or other such off balance sheet items can only be found in notes to account. So for example, if the company is facing a lawsuit, then this information you will find in the notes to account. Or if the company has given a guarantee on behalf of one of its subsidiaries, then this information can also be found only in the notes to account. As you can understand, this information is important to take into account before you make any investment decision. Next, let's look at another section within the financial statement, which is known as management discussion and analysis. Now, all publicly traded companies include a section in the annual report titled Management Discussion and Analysis. In this section, the management of the company discusses a variety of issues of concern, including the nature of business, the past result performance, and the future outlook of the company. This section is referred to by various names, including management report or management commentary, or operating and financial review, or simply management discussion and analysis. A fair management is expected to highlight any favorable or unfavorable trends and identify significant events and uncertainties that may affect the company's liquidity, capital resources, and future results of operations. Also, managements are expected to provide information about the effect of inflation, changing prices, or other material events that may affect the future operating results or the financial condition of the company. In addition, the management may provide information on off-balance sheet items, contractual commitment like purchase obligations, and also critical accounting policies or changes associated with accounting policies that may have significant impact on reported financial results. While in general there is no regulation with respect to what should be part of management discussion and analysis, nevertheless many regulators are moving in this direction to standardize the content of this section also, so that it is made more relevant for the investors. With this, we have broadly covered the contents of most financial statements. Now what we are going to do is move towards analyzing the information provided in these statements. So in the next video, we are going to see how we can analyze the balance sheet of a company. Let's start by understanding the term technical analysis. Technical analysis is a form of security analysis. This analysis uses price and volume data in order to make decisions regarding the future movement in price of the security. Since price and volume data are raw numbers, it could be difficult to directly interpret them. Hence, this data is often graphically displayed in order to ease analysis for decision making. The biggest advantage of technical analysis is that its application is not limited to any particular security or asset class. Hence, this technique can easily be used to analyze securities from different asset classes which are traded in a freely traded market. When we say freely traded market, we mean any market where willing buyers trade with willing sellers without any external impediment. The price of security in any freely traded market is a result of interaction of supply and demand for that security in real time. Since application of technical analysis only requires the price and volume data, it is often used for analyzing a wide range of financial instruments, including equities, bonds, commodity futures, and currency futures. Hence, the techniques you learn as part of this course can be readily applied to a variety of financial instruments. But before we look at various techniques, let's first understand the underlying logic behind technical analysis. The underlying logic of technical analysis is that the price of a security is only dependent on the supply and demand for that particular security. So as far as the technical analyst is concerned, these two factors are the only factors that ultimately affect the security's price. This also means that if there is any change in the supply of the security or any change in the demand for the security, it would lead to a corresponding change in the price for the security. Ultimately, since supply and demand for a security would directly reflect in the price and volume of the security, This also means that analyzing these data points can yield significant insights into the future price of the security. Hence, price of a security can be projected using charts and other technical analysis tools. A key feature of technical analysis is that technical analysis of any instrument does not require detailed knowledge of that instrument. As long as the chart represents the action in a freely traded market, an analyst does not even need to know the name or type of the security in order to conduct the analysis. Technical analysis can also be applied over any time frame, whether it be short-term price movements or long-term movements. Because fundamental analysis is more time consuming than technical analysis, investors with short time horizon, such as traders, tend to prefer technical analysis. At the same time, fundamental analysts with long time frames often perform technical analysis to time the purchase and sale of securities they have analyzed. Now that we have understood the term technical analysis, in the next video we are going to look at the common principles and assumptions behind technical analysis. In this module, we are going to look at technical indicators. Technical indicators are essentially tools that help us in our analysis by signaling how potential changes in supply and demand might affect a security's price. Let's start by defining what is a technical indicator. A technical indicator is a measure based on price, market sentiment, or fund flows that can be used to predict changes in price. In context of this course, when we say technical indicators, we are referring to price-based technical indicators. These indicators are essentially derived from the price of the security. These indicators often signal potential change in the security's price. Price-based technical indicators use current and past history of market prices. Price-based indicators may be simple indicators like moving averages or more complex indicators like oscillators. Here is a list of technical indicators that we will look at as part of this course. These include the moving averages, the Bollinger Bands, the momentum oscillators like rate of change, the relative strength indicator or RSI, stochastic oscillators, and in the end we will look at moving average convergence divergence or MACD. So starting next video, we'll first look at the technical indicator, which is the moving average. So see you in the next video. In this video, we are going to look at the continuation or runaway gap and also exhaustion gaps. Let's start with the continuation gaps first. Continuation or runaway gaps are very important as they give a rough indication of the possible extent of the move that is likely to follow. For these reasons, these gaps are also known as the measuring gap. The runaway gaps are not associated with congestion zones, but they actually occur in rapid advances or declines. So as you see in this case here, there has been a rapid decline in the market. Runaway gaps usually occur in these kind of markets. For example, in a fast moving market, the trading volumes are at peak at the initial breakout, and then the volume tapers off a little in the middle of the trend. This volume again peaks up to a high turnover as the move is finally halted. In such fast moves, we see that often a wide gap develops right in the middle of the move. So you see in this case you had a breakout gap and you had a further movement down on the next day after the breakout gap, and then you see another gap forming the very next day, and there is a considerable amount of trading on the next day, and prices also move far away from this gap. Now this is a runaway gap. This runaway gap is formed right in the middle of this downward movement, and so this gap will be able to tell you the extent of further move after the gap has been formed. These kind of gaps occur just about the halfway point between the breakout which inaugurated the move and the reversal day, or the time the prices enter a congestion pattern. The idea is that prices will go as much beyond the gaps as they have already traveled before the gap. Because of this, one can get a measurement of the move right after the formation of the gap. Now if you see this move, once this gap is formed and you want to forecast the further downside in the prices for the security, then what you should do is that you should measure the price movement before the gap was formed. So you see that prices roughly formed an intermediate high of 8533 and moved to 8230 just before the gap was formed. After the gap was formed, the trading started from a price of 8060. So now you can say that since the gap is formed right in the middle, so this gap is kind of a midpoint, and you should expect the prices to move as much below from 8060 as they moved before the gap was formed. So since the price move before the gap was formed happened from 8533 to 8230, this is approximately 300 points. It would be reasonable for you to assume that the price movement after the gap was formed would also be of 300 points, and so a target for you based on these 300 points would be approximately 7700. Now usually what happens is, once this kind of a gap is formed, many investors are caught off guard and often they don't know what they should do with their current position. For example, if they were short in this scenario, they may look for a point where they can book profits, or if they are long, they are probably looking for a point where they can average their existing positions or add new positions. Now once you see this kind of a gap, you should tell yourself that since a 300 point move happened before the gap was formed, now I should expect that the prices would move down by at least 300 points before I can expect some kind of correction. So you should definitely wait for prices to move by this much before you make any new investment. If 2 or 3 gaps intervene in a rapid move, then they all can be classified as a continuation gap. But as more gaps occur, the chances of one of them being an exhaustion gap increases, and an exhaustion gap actually indicates a reversal. So now we'll look at the other type of gap, which is the exhaustion gap. Exhaustion gaps, as the name suggests, comes at the end of the move. Hence they indicate exhaustion of a major move. These gaps are associated with rapid extensive advances or declines. In contrast to runaway gaps, the movement before appearance of exhaustion gap does not indicate any increase in resistance as they proceed. Basically, there is no tendency to lose momentum. On the contrary, the move continues to speed up until suddenly it hits a wall of supply, and the move is brought to an abrupt end by a day of terrific trading volume. In such strong moves, a wide gap sometimes occurs at the very end, that is between the last day of the move and the day just before the last day. Now what is not shown in this chart is that there was a terrific move from around 50 levels to this price of around 100. Also, the volume had tapered off in between, but on this day when this exhaustion gap was formed, you see that there was a sudden spike in the volume of trading. Now what had happened is that this upward price movement had suddenly hit a wall of supply, which is indicated by this spike in volume on this day. This gap formation with substantially higher volume on the last day indicates exhaustion of the move. The prices though may end up closing not very far away from the opening price of the day, and this formation combined with high volumes would indicate a likely exhaustion gap. This gap tells you that either the trend may reverse or the prices may enter a substantial consolidation phase before moving up again. Another thing to remember is that an exhaustion gap is usually preceded by at least one runaway gap or continuation gap, and hence the first gap in a fast moving market is very unlikely to be an exhaustion gap. Hence the first gap in a rapid advance or decline can be assumed to be a continuation gap for sure, but every other gap after the first gap should be treated with more and more suspicion of being an exhaustion gap. As a rule, continuation or runaway gap is not covered for a considerable length of time, but in case of exhaustion gaps, they are expected to be quickly closed, sometimes within 2 to 5 days. A word of caution here: An exhaustion gap taken by itself should not be read as a sign of reversal, but the halt is ordinarily followed by some sort of congestion development, which may in turn lead to either reversal or continuation of the move prior to the gap. However, in practically every case, enough of a minor reaction or delay ensues from the formation of an exhaustion gap before a new trend emerges. With this, we have covered the different types of gaps. In the next video, we are going to look at the topic of support and resistance. In this video, we will look at moving average. A moving average is the average of the closing price of a security over a specified number of periods. Moving averages smoothen out short-term price fluctuations and give a clear picture of the market trend. There are mainly three types of moving averages which are used by different traders. These include the simple moving average, the weighted moving average, and exponential moving average. The most basic of moving averages is the simple moving average. A simple moving average is the average of closing price of a security over a specified number of periods. In case of simple moving average, this average weighs each price equally over the period. This is in contrast to other types of moving averages which give relatively more weight to prices from the recent period. Let's start by looking at the formula of simple moving average. This here is the formula of simple moving average. Essentially, if you want to calculate a 5-day simple moving average, you take closing price of last 5 days and you add them up, and then you divide this sum by 5. So n here represents the number of periods for which the average is calculated, and you add the closing price of security for each of these periods and divide it by the number of periods to arrive at the simple moving average. Now let's break down this formula into subparts. Here is a different way of rearranging the same formula. So for a 5-day moving average, you are dividing each day's closing price by 5. This means for each of 5 days, a weight of 1 by 5 is assigned. So this is what we meant by saying that each price is given equal weight when calculating the simple moving average. Hence, the latest price of the security will receive the same weight as the price from older periods. This characteristic is in contrast to other types of moving averages which give more weight to data from recent periods. We'll cover this in a bit. The main question you may ask with respect to simple moving average is what should be the value of n that should be used to calculate the moving average. In other words, you may ask what period moving average you should be tracking for analysis. Now the number of data points to be included for creating a moving average depends on the intended use of the moving average. A 20-day moving average is often used because a month contains roughly 20 trading days. Similarly, a 60-day moving average is used because it represents a quarter year of trading activity. In general, longer term analysis requires use of more number of days compared to shorter term analysis. Now there are multiple ways to use moving averages. The first way to use moving average is to use it as a confirmation signal in conjunction with a price trend. Another way to use moving averages is by combining them with other moving averages and look for crossovers which may signal a change in trend. Apart from this, moving average lines are often used to determine support and resistance levels. But before we go into details with respect to moving averages, let's first understand the different types of moving averages, and later we'll look at how we can use moving averages. So for now, we move on to the next type of moving average, which is the weighted moving average. So in the next video, we will look at the weighted moving average. Now in case of simple moving average, we saw that the recent prices receive the same weight as past prices. This implies that the latest price changes, which actually reflect the latest information, is not reflected fast enough in the moving average. By assigning the same weight to the latest price and past price, effectively one is giving the same weight to past information and the latest information. But as you can understand, the latest information should be assigned more weight because it may provide a more accurate picture of supply and demand. In order to overcome this shortcoming of simple moving average, other types of moving averages give more weight to the more recent information and progressively lower weight to older information. This ensures that in case of weighted moving averages and exponential moving averages, the averages reverse direction more fast as compared to the simple moving average. Let's look at how weighted moving average achieves this. We will see how we can calculate the 5-day weighted moving average, as it would be easier to understand concepts if we are using numbers. In case of a 5-day moving average, we have 5 price data points. The 5th data point is the latest price, and the first data point is the oldest price among these 5 data points. We have also shown the price values associated with these data points. The first step in determining the weighted moving average is to determine the sum n. For example, in this case, the sum of n is the sum of numbers from 1 to 5. This is what is represented by sum n. In this case, the sum is 15. So you add 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 to get the sum, which is 15. The next step is to calculate the weighted moving average by using the formula here. What you need to do now is to multiply the most recent price by n, which is the number of periods. So for a 5-day weighted moving average, this n is 5, and hence we will multiply the latest price, which is 9 here, by 5 and divide this multiple by the sum of n, which is 15 here. So effectively the latest price of 5 has a weight of 5 divided by 15, which is essentially n by sum of n. Then you take the closing price of the second last period, which is 12 here, and multiply it to n minus 1, which is 4, and again you divide this by sum of n, which is 15. So here you see that the second last data point has a weight of n minus 1 divided by sum of n, which is 4 divided by 15 in this case. Now you calculate all these fractions and sum them up to arrive at the weighted moving average. As you see in the last column, here the latest price receives the highest weight, and the weight proportionately reduces as you go to the older data. Thereby the oldest price receives the lowest weight. So this is how a weighted moving average is calculated. In the next video, we are going to look at exponential moving average. Next we will look at the exponential moving average. In order to calculate the exponential moving average, you first need to calculate the simple moving average. So for example, if you want to construct a 20-day exponential moving average, you should first construct a 20-day simple moving average. The simple moving average becomes the starting point. The next step is to calculate a multiplier m, which is given by the formula shown here. So the multiply m equals 2 divided by number of time periods plus 1. So in this case, if you are calculating the 20-day moving average, then our multiplier m is given by 2 divided by 20 plus 1, which is approximately 0.1. The next step is to calculate the exponential moving average by using the formula shown here. In order to calculate the exponential moving average price for the current period, you take the closing price of the current period and subtract the exponential moving average of the previous day. You multiply this with the multiplier m. You add this calculation to the exponential moving average of the previous day to arrive at the exponential moving average of the present day. Let's try to understand the calculation by using numbers. Suppose these are the previous 20 data points. The 20-day simple moving average on day 20 is 9. So on day 20, we will start calculating our exponential moving average. Since our formula shown here requires a previous day exponential moving average, which we don't have currently, as this is the first period for which we are calculating the exponential moving average. So we will use the simple moving average value as our exponential moving average value for day 20. On day 21, we start applying our formula to calculate the exponential moving average for the period. So we subtract the exponential moving average of day 20, which is 9, from the closing price on day 21, which is 11. We then multiply this difference by the multiplier 0.1. We add the value of this expression to the previous day exponential moving average, which is 9, in order to arrive at the figure of 9.2, which is the day 21 exponential moving average. Now let's calculate the exponential moving average for day 22 to understand this better. So here we again subtract the exponential average of day 21, which is 9.2, from the closing price of day 22, which is 12. We multiply this difference to 0.1. We then add the value of this expression to the previous period moving average, that is day 21 moving average of 9.2, to arrive at the day 22 moving average value, which is 9.48. Now this calculation can be a bit overwhelming, but the good news is you don't need to perform this calculation, as technical analysis softwares do it for you. But what you need to remember is that exponential moving average give more weight to more recent period prices, and increasingly less weight is assigned to older prices. While it is not easily apparent by the formula here, but you need to remember that exponential moving average gives more weight to recent price compared to the weighted moving average, which in turn gives more weight to recent price compared to a simple moving average. By using exponential moving average, the recent price changes get reflected in the moving average faster. As we already mentioned, since simple moving average gives same weight to all the previous prices, they are slow to respond to changing prices. So the exponential moving average is fastest to respond to changing prices, while the simple moving average is the slowest to respond to changing prices. Now that we have seen the different types of moving average, in the next video, we are going to look at how to use moving averages. In this video, we are going to discuss when you will need to redraw a trend line. In this video, we are going to discuss this scenario by focusing on just the uptrend line to understand the basic concepts. Now in scenarios where prices go through a trend line, but do not break it by a decisive margin, and instead they come back above it, then you may be doubtful as to the authority of this original trend line. In such a scenario, you need to decide if this trend line should be discarded, or should it be revised, or should you just leave it as it is. Now if the original trend line has only 2 points, that is if the original trend line has not been subsequently tested by a minor counter trend move, then in such a scenario, you should redraw the line by using the first bottom and the new third bottom once the prices have moved up from the third bottom point. However, in scenarios where the original trend line has been tested before, if you see that prices briefly close below the trend line but then return to trade above the trend line, then you may disregard this penetration and continue to track the original trend line. Another little detail that you should remember is that any intraday break through a trend line that has been tested before should always be disregarded and the line should be left as it is. There is another scenario where you may require to redraw a trend line. So for example, say you have a trend line passing through 2 minor bottoms in an uptrend. Now suppose you see a third minor bottom is formed, but this bottom is formed well above the trend line. Then in such a scenario, you should keep the original trend line, but you should also draw a new line by joining the second and third minor bottom And then you should track both these lines. If you see that the new trend line is broken soon, then you should discard the new trend line and you should stick to the original trend line. However, if you see that the new trend line happens to stay valid for a substantial period of time, say for a few weeks, then you may discard the old trend line in favor of the new trend line, and you should use this new line to track the uptrend. Let's look at an example to understand this. Here is the chart of a cement stock from the Indian markets. When you see the trend unfolding here, you see that there are two bottoms that have formed. You may connect these to form a trend line. Then you have this kind of a price up move followed by a correction resulting in another bottom formation. Now you can connect this new bottom to the second bottom to form another trend line. Now you can continue to track both these lines to see how the price action evolves. As it happens in this case, the second trend line gets tested a little later, resulting in validation of this trend line. So now you can safely discard the first trend line and rely on this new trend line. With this, we have covered all the details with respect to trend lines. In the next video, we will look at another related concept, which is the concept of trend channels. In this video, we are going to look at some considerations related to charts in general. For any chart, be it line chart, bar chart or candlestick, the vertical axis can be constructed either with a linear scale, which is also known as the arithmetic scale, or it can be constructed with a logarithmic scale, depending on how you want to view the data. In order to understand the difference between the linear scale and logarithmic scale, I have produced two charts here. One is a linear scale chart and other is the logarithmic scale chart. When you look at the linear scale chart, you see that the distance between 5 to 10 on vertical scale is same as the distance between 10 to 15. Also you see that the distance between the price of 10 and 20 is the same as the distance between 20 and 30. But now if you look at the log scale, you see that the distance between 10 and 20 is the same as the distance between 20 and 40. What this means is that when the price of a security moves from 10 to 20, during this period the prices have given a return of 100%. Similarly, when prices move from 20 to 40, again the security has given a return of 100%. So in case of log scale, equal vertical distances on the chart correspond to an equal percentage change. So for example, when you move from 10 to 100, there is a tenfold increase in the price of a security. Similarly, when you move from 100 to 1000, there is again a tenfold increase in the price of the security. Now you might wonder, why would someone want to plot prices using log scale? This is so because log scale is appropriate for analysis when prices move through a range of values representing several orders of magnitude. So for example, if you are analyzing a stock that has moved from 10 to 10,000, you should be using the log scale to plot the prices. An arithmetic or linear scale, on the other hand, is better suited for narrower ranges, example for price movements from 35 to 50. The next important consideration when dealing with charts is volume. Volume is actually an important characteristic that is included at the bottom of many charts. It is used to assess the strength or conviction of buyers and sellers in determining a security's price. If volume increases during a time frame in which price is also increasing, that combination is considered positive and the two indicators confirm each other. This signal is interpreted to mean that over time more investors are buying the financial instrument and they are doing so at higher and higher prices. Also, if volume and prices diverge, for example if stock's price rises while its volume declines, it means that fewer and fewer market participants are willing to buy that stock at the new price. If this trend in volume continues, The price rally will soon end because the demand for the security at higher prices will cease. In many of the tools we discuss, we'll be using this characteristic of volume to further confirm our analysis. For now, we will move on to the next important consideration. The next important consideration is the time interval used to plot the chart. Most of the charts we use in this tutorial are daily charts. Now, daily charts plot price action on each day, with each day being plotted on the horizontal axis. However, one can also use hourly, half-hourly, 5-minute or even 1-minute chart for short-term trading. Similarly, for longer-term investing, one can use weekly, monthly or even yearly charts. The key advantage of technical analysis is that the same analytical approach applies irrespective of the time interval used. However, using long time intervals allow the analyst to chart longer time periods than does using short time intervals, since long intervals contain fewer data points. Also, it is common to use many different time frames to analyze any security. Now, keeping these considerations in mind, we will start looking at specific tools to analyze securities. So in the next video, we'll look at an important analytical pattern, which is known as the gap. Now let's look at some candlestick patterns that can be used to determine reversal points in the market. Now these patterns are a combination of two or more candlesticks appearing after an uptrend or a downtrend. Let's first define what is a reversal candlestick pattern. A reversal pattern is essentially a combination of candlesticks that indicates a reversal in trend. One should pay attention to the trend before the pattern to determine whether the pattern is bullish or bearish. Essentially, a bullish reversal pattern would only be valid if it appears after a downtrend, and a bearish reversal pattern would only be valid if it appears after an uptrend. So for example, you cannot have a bullish reversal pattern appearing after an uptrend. Now let's look at the different reversal patterns. The first reversal pattern we'll be looking at is the engulfing pattern. An engulfing pattern can be a bullish engulfing pattern or a bearish engulfing pattern, depending on the implication of the pattern. This pattern consists of two candlesticks of different colors. A bullish engulfing pattern occurs after a market fall and indicates a change in trend. The first candle in a bullish engulfing pattern is a black candle, which reinforces the recent downtrend. The next candle is a white candle, where the white body completely engulfs the previous period's black body. Now this indicates that the bulls have taken over from the bears. Now opposite of a bullish engulfing pattern is a bearish engulfing pattern, which occurs after a market rally. The first candle of this two candle pattern is a white body signifying the recent upward trend. The next candle is a black body, which completely engulfs the previous period's white body and thus indicates that the bears have taken over from bulls, and you can expect a substantial reversal in the uptrend. Now the next reversal pattern we'll look at is the dark cloud cover. This is also a 2-day reversal pattern with bearish implication. Since this pattern has a bearish implication, it should appear after an uptrend for it to be valid. The first day of this pattern is a long white candlestick. It reflects the current trend of the market, which is up. And the next day, the prices open above the high price of the previous day, which essentially adds to the bullishness of the previous day. But then the prices trade lower for the rest of the day, with closing price at least below the midpoint of the body of the first day. This signifies significant blow to the bulls, as many might be forced to exit the market. Since the second candle has a black body, this is referred to as the dark cloud in the name dark cloud cover. The occurrence of this pattern after an uptrend signifies a substantial pullback in prices. It may also indicate a complete change of trend. However, if this pattern appears in a downward trending market, then it has no forecasting value. Now the next pattern is the piercing line pattern, which is opposite of the dark cloud cover pattern. Now for this pattern to be of significance, it should occur after a substantial downtrend. The first candle in this pattern is a long black candlestick, which essentially confirms the downward trend to the trader. The next day prices open at a new low, but then recover to trend higher all day, and ultimately the prices close above the midpoint of the first candlestick's body. This signifies significant change in the downtrend and may force many traders to reverse or exit their position. Since this pattern is formed only after a downtrend, it is essentially a bullish reversal signal, and the prices are expected to move up after occurrence of this pattern. Also, it should be obvious that if this pattern occurs in an uptrend, then it has no forecasting value. The final reversal patterns we'll look at are the evening and morning stars. Now the evening and morning stars are both 3-day reversal patterns that are just opposite to each other. A evening star is a bearish reversal pattern. The first day of this pattern is a bullish white candlestick, signifying the uptrend in full force. On the second day, the prices open gap up and trade in a narrow range. On this day, the opening and closing prices are near to each other, but throughout the day, the prices continue to stay above the body of the previous day. On the third day, there is a change in trend, and the prices open lower with a gap below the body of the second day, and further the prices close lower, going below the midpoint of the body of the first day. This essentially signals a reversal in the uptrend. Now you should wait for all 3 candlesticks to be completed before you initiate any action. Now the opposite of evening star is the morning star. Hence, morning star is a bullish reversal pattern, and its occurrence is of significance only if it comes after a significant downtrend. Now the first day in this pattern is a bearish black candlestick, which signifies the downtrend in full force. On the second day, the prices open lower with a gap and trade in a narrow range. The opening and closing price on the second day are near each other, but the prices continue to stay below the body of the first day. On the third day, the prices open with a gap up above the body of the second day, and they happen to close higher with the closing prices above the midpoint of the body of the first day. The completion of this pattern essentially signals a reversal in the downtrend. Now these are some important reversal patterns which will indicate to you a change in trend. In the next lecture, we'll look at some continuation candlestick patterns. Now that we have understood support and resistance concept, let's look at how we can determine which support or resistance level has more strength. We are sharing here 3 criterion that you may use to evaluate the relative strength of a support or resistance. These criterion are volume, distance, and time elapsed. Let's look at these one by one to better understand them, starting with volume. When we say volume, we mean the volume that has been traded at a particular support or resistance level. So when comparing 2 support levels, if you see that there is a price level where few thousand shares changed hands, while only a few hundred shares changed hands at the other support level, it is reasonable for you to expect that the level with higher number of shares traded will be a stronger support or resistance, because there is potentially a larger demand or supply that may emerge around that level. This is simply because a larger number of people might be potentially stuck with a long or short position at that price level, and given an opportunity, they will be very keen at getting out even. The smarter and more experienced ones might even be ready to sacrifice a point or two because they realize that this level is a strong resistance level, with many people stuck with long positions who are also eager to get out. and so the prices may not even reach that level because of the anticipated selling pressure. So to summarize, the higher the volume at a particular level, the more strong support or resistance it may provide. The next important criteria to estimate the strength of support or resistance level is the extent of move after the break of particular support or resistance level. The idea is that if a support level is broken and prices fell below it, then when the prices come back to test this level, which now will be a resistance level, the strength of this resistance will depend on how far the prices fall below before coming back to test this level. The further the prices fall away from this level, the stronger the resistance will be on this level. So for example, here are two different cases in which support levels get broken. As you see in the first case, the fall was further away, so you should expect this first level to provide stronger resistance as prices come back to test it. So in general, the greater the distance prices fall, if prices break below a support level, the greater the resistance from the level when the prices try to retest that level. The next criteria for estimating the strength of resistance of an old support level is the amount of time that has passed since it was formed. In general, a supply point which is only an year or two old will be more effective resistance level compared to a level that is 4 to 5 years old. But this is not to mean that the older resistance level loses all its importance. In fact, you may be surprised to know how effective a very old resistance or support level might be if it hasn't been attacked since it was created. This is because every time a support or resistance level is attacked, it loses some of its potency because some of the overhanging supply or demand would be used up in repelling the attack. So the next time this level is attacked again, it would be less capable in repelling the attack. In such cases, you may look at the subsequent trading volume at those levels and compare it to the trading volume when the support or resistance level was first created. This will help you in determining if the support or resistance level volume has exhausted itself. With this, we have covered the three main factors that you may use to evaluate the strength of the support or resistance. So see you in the next video.